for you. It's got a knob adjustment on the back, right? Turn it down.
All right, so today is going to be our final teaching on this, as I refer to it, spiritual illustration of the letters and their alphabetical structure and some of our discussion. And I have only 2 sheets that I've given you, but it's actually 3 because one has one stuff on the back. And I hope to get through all of it just because it was so exciting, but if we don't, we don't. I do want to share with you something that is exactly where we left off last week. I really wanted to get to because it was just something that struck me. I shared it last Saturday, so I'm going to kind of breeze through. I'm just going to talk to you about the concept, and then I'm going to read through the scripture, which we basically would be starting on page 7, which was Psalm 69. The entire psalm is on this page. And the reason, there's a few reasons why I shared this and included it in this teaching last week. And the main number one reason is because of an insight that God asked me some questions about and shared with me last week that just really impacted my life. And my own personal thinking and appreciation for him. And then right at the beginning of the psalm, there were a couple of different lines that were things we talked about in this alphabetical structure of the letters and insights that I just thought were really relative to what we've been discussing. So let me just tell you the insight that even caused us to get included all together is last week I talked to you about how it was my favorite portion of the alphabet to teach is right at the beginning there where you see Vav coming in conjunction, so to speak, into a yoke with a Zayin. So you see man coming into yoke with the crowned man, and the next letter Ket is formed. And that's just one of my favorite areas of the letters where you see this unity of relationship. And one of the things that struck me last week is we talk all the time about knowing and understanding, or we claim to know and understand all the time, the sacrifice and the suffering that Yeshua went through to prepare for us our salvation. And that is part of the epitome of our relationship is trying to understand, right, and trying to realize that the Son of God, Yeshua, laid down his life so that we would have salvation and an opportunity to dwell with God, to dwell in relationship with him for an eternal state. But last week, the same question, softly and slowly, the Spirit spoke to me last week and asked me if I understood that same amount of suffering and sacrifice was what he took on so that I could also put my head in the yoke and be discipled. And what I mean by that is, most of the time when you find yourself teaching and you find yourself as a teacher in any venue, you really are pouring a portion of who you are into your students. And you hope that they utilize the information that you taught them to a degree that was, 1, beneficial for their life, and 2, reflects that the teaching is stuck or that it's been effective. And me saying all this isn't to try and, urge some message about myself and what I share here. That's, I don't aspire to be that, to think of myself that greatly. But what it meant for me is, how seriously do I take the ridicule, the struggle, the words from the devil, or anything else that Yeshua would encounter in choosing to take Phil on as a disciple? How much do I realize how much suffering or how much controversy he allows himself to go through to be interested in allowing me to put my head in the yoke and connect myself to him? How serious am I taking that? How serious am I approaching this obligation that I have to live and to conform and to change my life to line up with what he has prepared? And it just for the last week and a half, this is what I meant to tell you last week before I left, is, hey, if I've been playing with this, I wasn't going to let you guys go home scot-free, but it happened anyway last week. But this has just really been some convicting ideology that's been on me for the last week. Because again, the Spirit just spoke very, very softly to me about understanding that the same level of suffering, his arrest, his persecution, his crucifixion, all of this suffering was not only so that I could be saved, but so that I could also take his yoke upon me, so that I could learn from him. And Psalm 69 is literally that. It is, when we read through it and you listen to me read it, you're going to hear all kinds of scripture that's quoted and it was prophesied that the Messiah would go through this. And this is what he would endure. And one line in particular where we talked about how not even the hairs of someone's head would, be ashamed, or, that we shouldn't expect to even see one hair of our head change, that God cares that much for us, and so even the sparrows, are accounted for. So this ideology, and Yeshua uses that to his disciples and to people that are listening to him at one point. He says God even cares about the hairs on your head. Not even one of them would fall away without his knowledge. And the reason why he does that in part is to make a connection that if you didn't know Psalm 69, you might miss. Because the same thing is said of him. So I'm just going to read through, and you'll see some of that connection. This is part of what brought it up, is when he talks about how people treated him. And I want to share at the end of this, I'll share one thing with a line that I have circled. Psalm 69 says, "For the choir director, according to Shoshanim, a psalm of David. Save me, O God, for the waters have threatened my life. I have sunk in deep mire, and there is no foothold. I have come into deep waters, and a flood overflows me. I am weary with crying, my throat is parched, my eyes fail while I wait for my God. Those who hate me without a cause are more than the hairs of my head. Those who would destroy me are powerful, being wrongfully my enemies. What I did not steal, I then have to restore. O God, it is thou who dost know my folly, and my wrongs are not hidden from thee. May those who wait for thee not be ashamed through me, O Lord God of hosts. May those who seek thee not be dishonored through me. O God of Israel, because for thy sake I have borne reproach, dishonor has covered my face. I have become estranged from my brothers and an alien to my mother's sons. For zeal for thy house has consumed me, and the reproaches of those who reproach thee have fallen on me. When I wept in my soul with fasting, it became my reproach. When I made sackcloth my clothing, I became a byword to them. Those who sit in the gate talk about me, and I am the song of the drunkards. But as for me, my prayer is to thee, O Lord, in an acceptable time. O God, in the greatness of thy loving kindness, answer me with thy saving faith. Deliver me from the mire, and do not let me sink. May I be delivered from my foes and from the deep waters. May the flood of water not overflow me, and may the deep not swallow me up, and may the pit not shut its mouth on me. Answer me, O Lord, for thy loving kindness is good. According to the greatness of thy compassion, turn to me. And do not hide thy face from thy servant, for I am in distress. Answer me quickly. O draw near to my soul and redeem it. Ransom me because of my enemies. Thou dost know my approach and my shame and my dishonor. All my adversaries are before thee. Reproach has broken my heart, and I am so sick, and I looked for sympathy, but there was none, and for comforters, but I found none. They also gave me gall for my food, and for my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink. May their table before them become a snare, and when they are in peace, may it become a trap. May their eyes grow dim, so that they cannot see, and make their loins shake continually. Pour out thine indignation on them, and may thy burning anger overtake them. May their camp be desolate, may none dwell in their tents. For they have persecuted whom thou thyself hast smitten, and they tell of the pain of those whom thou hast wounded. Do thou add iniquity to their iniquity, and may they not come into thy righteousness. May they be blotted out of the book of life, and may they not be recorded with righteousness. But I am afflicted and in pain. May thy salvation, I am afflicted and in pain. May thy salvation, O God, set me securely on high. I will praise the name of God with song, and shall magnify him with thanksgiving, and it will please the Lord better than an ox or a young bull with horns and a hoof. The humble have seen it and are glad. You who seek God, let your heart revive. For the Lord hears the needy and does not despise who are prisoners. Let heaven and earth praise him, the seas and everything that moves in them. For God will save Zion and build the cities of Judah, that they may dwell there and possess it. And the descendants of his servants will inherit it, and those who love his name will dwell in it. It's possible for us to, at the same time, we try and put our minds in the yoke and learn from him, which really is pictured by putting your head in his word, putting your head in the book and studying and learning. It's possible for us to put our head in that book and learn different things that we use for our own gratification, or we use for our own selfish pleasures. People are doing it regularly throughout the world. They preach so that people will listen to them, so that they will join them, so that they will sit down with them, so that they will tithe with them, so that they will provide them something. And Paul, in retrospect of this idea, says so long as Christ is preached, whether it's for selfish gain or whether it's just for the outward giving of the message, as long as Christ is preached, that's what's relevant. So there is something to be said about that, but at the end of the day, to take on that responsibility of being a disciple literally comes with responsibility of not just learning from him that which sounds good, but putting into effect in our lives that which benefits others and that which benefits ourselves.
Benefits others.
Mhm. Yeah, incorporating his
This
teaching.
prayer of David is never mentions others other than what he wants to done to them. His prayer is a demonstration of human prayer.
I always thought it was wrong to ask for vengeance from the God. You know, like for some reason, like that was always the way I was understanding, was that you're not supposed to ask God to take vengeance on somebody. It's his timing and his choice.
There is an entire teaching around that idea, and it really presents itself when you look at what David is asking for. So, yes, some of the language is hard. Asking for someone to be blotted out of the book of life is a pretty strong statement when you understand what some of it means. But what David is looking for and asking for is, especially when we put this in reference to the Messiah, is looking for the extinguishing of people being able to spread whatever that disease is or whatever that issue is that they have. So asking for them to have people removed out of their midst, asking for their tents to not grow and expand, asking for their ability to influence others around them. It oftentimes, that's part of the idea around this, is that oftentimes his request for vengeance, so to speak, is that those things are what stop. Not a matter of, throw him literally in a pit full of snakes and scorpions so that he's stung and bitten to death and, murdered. That's
just typical of humankind to pray that way. I've heard it many times.
so at the very beginning, one thing
People curse others.
One thing I circled in verse 4, it says, "Those who hate me without a cause are more than the hairs of my head." As you might read or study Jewish commentary over the years, if you do, you will find a pretty common phrase shared all the time, which is sinat kinam. The words sinat kinam are hatred without a cause. And it's said that the temple, both the first and the second temples, were destroyed because of sinat kinam, hatred without a cause. Just pure, unadulterated hatred. And this is what David is talking about, those that just have a despising feeling for him, and that's what he's thinking. But Yeshua says, and the same thing is said of him, those who hated me without a cause. And later this passage is quoted. And I think it was Rav Kook, I think is the name of the individual who's quoted, was having said that if the temple and if the dwelling place of God, and we'll say and understand his Messiah, if he is destroyed with sinat kinam, which is gratuitous hatred or causeless hatred, then the temple and the dwelling place of God would be rebuilt through what is referred to as ahavat kinam, which is causeless love or baseless love. This is a famous statement. I should have either printed it out for you guys or I should put it on the board, but this is a famous quote, that if the temple would be destroyed through causeless, baseless hatred, then it would be rebuilt through causeless love. And what's interesting is you have ahavat kinam and you have sinat kinam. So clearly you have the same word kinam in both references. But if you add up all the numerical values of the letters that make the phrases sinat kinam and yuvat kinam, ahavat, what you'll find is, and then you can ask the question, this is a little play on words that I play mathematically, is ask what is the difference between them? And you can literally subtract the higher from the lower from the higher to find what the literal mathematical difference is between causeless hatred and causeless love. And what's interesting I found years ago is that the value of the difference between these two is literally Vayomer Elohim, which in Hebrew means and God said. The difference between causeless hatred and causeless love is literally what God has said. When you devote your time and your life and your interest in learning what God has said about a matter, and you study it out and you apply it into your life, that is the difference in changing yourself. From having causeless hate or dislike for something you may know nothing about into loving things without reason. always easy for us to love something with a reason. When do we choose to love someone or something for no reason at all? Just simply because, no less, no more than just simply because their presence were there. So, what's said of Yeshua is that they hated him without a cause. He was crucified and hung up, and people didn't have the cause that they claimed to have in him, in the Pharisaical group that challenged for his death to be taken. So I guess I would just leave you guys with that, man. Think for yourselves about what it means to put your head in the yoke and to be yoked to him and to take on that responsibility of relationship. You know, how do we best reveal that our heads have been put in the yoke with him? So if nobody has any comments, we'll just move into just another recap.
Before we move on, this 20, verse 20b, and for my thirst they give me vinegar to drink. That's kind of reminds you of Jesus when he was on the cross. They gave him vinegar to drink.
That's one of the quotes out here. Yes, this is why this is considered a messianic psalm, because there are like 7 different things out of this that he fulfilled in prophecy. And gall is actually a mixture of vinegar and wine. And being that he was under a particular vow, which most people don't realize this, they don't know this, Yeshua was actually putting himself under a vow of the Nazarite vow, so to speak, before he went into the temple, and some of the processes he took. And under that vow, you're not to drink wine. And when he went into that situation of being crucified and they offered it to him, that's why he turned his head and didn't take it. So even in the midst of his being up on the cross and dying of thirst, or having that as one of his issues, he refuses to drink the wine that they offer him through the vinegar, which was being offered as a sense of mercy. If you understand this, it was being offered as a sense of mercy, not as insult, because if he had drank as much as he wanted of that, he might have found some relief from his pain and some relief from the suffering, as he could have gotten drunk or anything else. So, all right, so the first, I'm just going to kind of recap through where you're at to get to this new page. The first group of 7 letters paints an image and paints a display of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit sending a messenger out of the house of God who comes with a message of the gospel. And I hope that's clearly what you guys saw, what you experienced. The second group of 7 letters, you find my chart. What do you want? This?
Next one? No.
Oh, this?
Yeah.
Oh, didn't I give you one?
No.
The second group of 7 letters shows the relationship that you form with Yeshua as you come into yoke with him, and what begins to take place after that. And as soon as you're coming into that place of discipleship and you choose to submit yourself, you find yourself with a reminder regularly throughout life of being in the presence of God, and you begin to build what effectively will become your confession. We talked about that a little bit last week, and we'll see that this week. But you begin to see that God has prepared a work of righteousness for you to walk in, and through the abilities of ministering and testimony and humility, to those 3 skill levels, you find yourself displaying that. And again, this isn't, and I want to make this clear, this isn't intended to be a formula, so to speak, of like, this is exactly what salvation looks like. If you have better words that you want to put in for what you see, or if you feel like something is missing in one of these stages or steps, feel free to incorporate it. But this is definitely, for me, what definitely seems to be a process or a state of being that I've gone through. Dave,
Is this a check?
I kind of just breezed through that. So that was part of last week's. That was part of the second group of 7 letters. That group begins with letter Chet and goes from discipleship all the way up through humility, right? And as you learn and understand what discipleship really includes, if you want to call it this, once you learn discipleship, you understand submission is going to be required as you're in the presence of God, and choosing to intentionally submit yourself to that. And then to get to a place of having humility, you're going to build ministering in the lives of those around you, which is in turn going to cause testimony to begin to form in your life. So here is what I will tell you about this last group of 7 letters. And if you notice at the bottom of your page, I actually have the last letter on here for a reason, and we'll talk about that because I'm not going to do a separate week on that. But this group of 7 letters is the ongoing process of sanctification. The spiritual images or the spiritual illustration the letters give is the ongoing process of sanctification that you have been going through and will continue to go through until you die. The experiences of these letters, the illustrations of each of these letters, is something that even on a sometimes minute-by-minute daily basis, you find yourself growing in, struggling with, encountering, and having to make decisions in these realms. They are just continual states of being. And what's interesting is starting with the first one, right after you have the experience of choosing to humble yourself, which is where the letter Nun ended. Once, you have two options in life when it comes to humility. You either humble yourself or you get humbled. One way or the other, you're going to recognize humility in your life. And once you really begin to learn the value of intentionally committing yourself to humility and humbling yourself, it becomes much easier to enter into this last phase, which is trust. This last phase of life, whether you're 94 or 49 or 24, we always have a lot of our relationship with God based on trust. How far and how willing are we to trust that He literally is sovereign and has control over every aspect of creation, let alone our lives?
That related to faith, trust.
In a way, yes. This is all a process of building your faith, right? And putting your faith into practice.
I like the word, and what's the parable of the daughter?
So it's definitely, all of this is a process of building faith, and trust is a matter of choosing to entwine your life with God, specifically in the areas where you don't know what's going to happen. Specifically, where you don't know what's going to happen. Faith is definitely a big part of that, because there are times in life when, so to speak, as we loosely refer to it, blind belief, so to speak, is required. There are moments in life when that level of faith is required. More often than not, faith should be more or better translated or utilized in our lives as faithfulness in an action that you put forth in your daily life based on the experiences that you've had. But sometimes it has to be based as well on just trust and knowing that God is going to provide, whether you see how or not.
Now, faith, to me, is a relationship with God. Faithfulness is the expression of that in my life.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily opposed to that, but faithfulness
In fact,
should be,
trust is part of faith.
yeah,
It's
faith
very broad, inclusive.
Faith is the substance of things not seen, is what the text says. And while I'm not disputing in any way, nor intending to degrade what you said there, Dave, someone like Abraham, when he has an actual interaction, which I'm going to assume that most of us have not had, when he has an actual interaction and discussion and talk with God, faith is not the correct term that describes his relationship with God, because faith is the substance of things not seen. And the longer we go on in our relationship and the more it builds, where faith becomes applicable is, again, choosing to walk in faithfulness in the times where you cannot see necessarily what God is doing. Because once you get to a place of having that belief, and you have that experience and that exposure to His presence in your life, and you have that, then faith is increased as faithfulness in a sense. But the relationship we have with Him is one where we either, truly entrust ourselves to Him, or we don't. And faith can, we can still have faith in Him and choose to not entrust ourselves entirely to Him and trust on our own measures, trust on our own actions, our own works. So this is a place that you have to, this is why this group of letters starts in this particular area, and the messages that are displayed in each. As we move on, what you're going to see in these next few is that they're actually, the letters are kind of linked together is the way that I see it. When you do one, the other one is what happens. What we'll see as we move forward. Samech literally means to trust, but it is also, or it spiritually illustrates trust, but the word in Hebrew, Samech, literally means support, to support. And when the priest is performing a sacrifice in the temple, it says that he submects himself on the head of the animal as he's getting ready to prepare to slaughter the animal and offer it in sacrifice. And what this means is that he would literally put his fingers together in this kind of a clenched position and would rest his hands on the head of the animal, and literally is to support himself and lift himself up, so to speak. He would lift himself up off the ground on the head of the animal and would support his weight on the head of the animal and would put great pressure on it. And what this shows is that you are to apply yourself into the sacrifice that you're preparing. And that is a sign of trust, so to speak. That is a sign of believing that you are just as willing to support what God has said about preparing a sacrifice as much as you desire in the sacrifice you're offering, that he support you. Sacrifices that we make for God are oftentimes made with the human element of both wanting to give thanksgiving and praise to God, but at the same time also desiring something from him. And learning how to line ourselves up with him, learning how to trust in him in the times and the moments that we may not understand, are part of that key. The next letter, ayin, is a silent letter, and we're going to spend some time talking about it. And it literally is the word in Hebrew, which means eyes. And for me, this was a pretty easy one. It came to me years ago as far as a spiritual illustration, because I can promise you that whatever you focus the attention of your eyes on is what you're going to become devoted to. The amount of time that you spend looking at something and engaging it, and you turn your eye, even what we have loosely referred to as, our inner eye, or the third eye, meaning the mind, and what you turn your mind to. Whatever you focus your attention on, you're going to become devoted to. And what's interesting, the letter ayin, which literally, the word ayin, and the name of the letter is literally the word for eye. If you even look at it, you could say that it looks like two eyeballs with the optic nerves, or the two stems connected to the optic nerve. And what's interesting is this letter is the only other silent letter. The first letter of the alphabet, Aleph, is a silent letter, and we're going to look at some great relationships between them, hopefully, before our Bible study time is over. But the next letter that follows it is the letter Pei, which literally means mouth. In Hebrew, the word Pei means mouth. And this is where the confession comes in. This is why I say all the time that testimony is something that we build through life and through life experiences, but how it manifests and comes back out is really through a form of confession, and that's when it's the most effective. You can have somebody stand up and give a testimony about something they experienced from an outside third-person perspective. And even if it's their own life experiences, but they sound like they're standing up just giving testimony about it, and it's not really authentic or part of who they are, it doesn't resonate with people as much as when you give it as a confession. I don't know if you guys understand what I'm saying there, but that seems to be...
What's the reference our gates mean?
Where do I have that?
Under the shepherd's staff.
Under what?
Under the column that's headed shepherd's staff.
Oh,
What's our gates mean?
I don't know why.
The gate,
I see it.
Or the gates.
So, yeah, the eyes are the gateway to the soul. That's an old Hebrew idiom. And then if you remember when we had, if you remember when we had our teaching on the five senses, remember that these two letters, really, the connection between them is referencing our senses, because you have eyes and you have a mouth, right? And so our gates, entry into our life, is through our eyes. So one of the things that is said during that teaching of the senses is that your eyes sometimes, you don't necessarily always have full control over. Sometimes you see things with your eyes that you wish you hadn't seen. Oftentimes you can also be very intentional to look at things, and oftentimes we do that with things we should be looking at. But the gateway to our inside, so to speak, where we also experience our spiritual senses, is they can manifest on in the physical senses. And so what I was saying about the connections between the letters is with ayin and pei, obviously they both are speaking of body parts. That's one simple connection. But whatever you devote yourself to, you will then confess in your life. If you devote your time and your eyes towards looking at things that are negative or things that are wrong or things that are inappropriate, then you're going to be confessing the same types of behavior and activity in your life. If you devote your time and your effort to studying God's Word and reading it regularly, then that's going to become the confession of your life. This is what I mean when I say there's an interactive relationship between each pair of letters after we start with trust and we start with psalm. And again, trust, devotion, and confession are all three, along with the rest of these, areas of your process of sanctification you will deal with on a sometimes minute-by-minute basis, on a daily basis, all the time. These are processes that we deal with just throughout the rest of our lives and time as a believer. The next letter, Zadi, I used to say was the spiritual illustration of this was righteousness, because Zadi in Hebrew, again, a Zadik, is literally a righteous person. Zadi in Hebrew means righteousness. That's literally what it means. But just simply having righteousness and having remember I've told you before that there are two sides of righteousness. There's passive and active. There are plenty of people who have a passive understanding of what righteousness is, but without obedience, it's ineffective. Without obedience, it means nothing, and it affects no change in your life or in the lives of those around us. And Zadi happens to be one of those letters that is, I think I've told you this before, but it looks like, and it's said to be drawn as though it's a righteous person who's on his knees. He's got his hands raised in the air praying. And if you remember, Zadi is one of these letters that at the end of a word stands up and becomes longer. And there is a psalm, I don't remember what it is. Oh, it's a proverb. I have it written down on my sheet. It's Proverbs 12:7 that says, in the end, the righteous will stand.
You're showing these sub-letters just because they're somewhere in shape or what?
I don't understand.
Well, next to PEH, however you pronounce it,
Hey,
you got a B sub-letter beside it.
That's what it looks like at the end of a word. There's 5 letters that take on that final form at the end of a word, and Pei and Zadi are both of those letters. And then up on your chart, Mem and Nun are 2 other ones. So when that letter comes at the end of a word, it takes on a different shape. So let's go back to the mouth for a minute. Pei, which is right in front of Zadi. Pei, you could say, with a line drawn at the bottom of it, is a closed mouth. And anytime the Pei comes at the front of a word or in the middle of a matter, it's closed. The mouth doesn't open. It gets longer, so to speak. It opens when it comes to the end of things. You guys understand what I'm talking about? You see this reference?
I do, but it looks exactly like beat or bite, however you pronounce the second letter. Bait.
Oh, okay, never mind. Hold on. You're asking me something different. So, hold on. Okay, let me just share this with you. Okay, what you're asking me about is this sub-letter.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I was looking at the chart. I was looking at something else. You're asking me about these small letters here. We'll get to that in a minute. Just bear with me a second. We'll get to that in a minute.
I have a question though.
We'll get to that in a minute.
How come this has a dot
It is.
in this stuff?
Because one would be a P, the other's a PH. So the P this would be a P sound, this would be a PH sound. It can have either. Remember, that letter has either the F or the P sound. It's either a hard P, which is when you have a P, or it has the FH if it doesn't have a P.
Oh, I don't remember the dot in K though.
Sorry. Okay, listen, sorry, we'll get to that in a second. I'm sorry, we'll get to that in a second. Let me just breeze through and tell you the rest of these letters real quick. You can write down spiritual illustration, then we'll talk about why I put that something. I'm sorry, I was looking at my sheet here and I have it drawn in pen. I forgot that I printed it out and made it bigger on your sheet. I forgot I did that. So just bear with me. The letter Zadi spiritually illustrates obedience, and it pairs with the next letter Kof, and this is an interesting connection. Everybody always asks me, how do you get the spiritual illustration of circumcision on the letter Kof, which in Hebrew, the word Kof is the letter Kof is the first letter of the word Kadosh, which means holy, right? But interestingly, in Hebrew, the word for monkey is kof. And the only thing that sets us apart from monkeys is holiness, choosing to set ourselves apart. Otherwise, a man who just runs around and does what he wants for himself is no greater than a monkey. Now, how does circumcision come in?
Cutting it off.
Exactly. Circumcision is the process of removing removal of blockage. And holiness is a process of doing what God has commanded, being holy because I am holy, setting yourself apart by doing the things that he gives instruction about, which almost always requires the cutting away of yourself and what you want, especially when you've been raised with zero understanding of what a relationship with God looks like. Even if we've been raised as a Gentile in a world of not understanding anything about Torah or Old Testament or traditional practice or observance or anything, and we just simply have been told that Yeshua is the Son of God who's laid down his life for us, and trust in him, you will still continue to be in a lifelong learning lesson of what it means to remove your will and desires and get them out of the way so that you can have a relationship with others in the fashion that he intended. And circumcision is literally the removal of that blockage. That's what it is. Interestingly, the relationship and the Old Testament is sometimes referred to in Hebrew circles as the Brit Chadashah. And what this means is a covenant, right? The covenant is the covenant between Abraham and God is what's being referenced. And the idea of relationship, and Paul in the New Testament, reveals to us and helps us understand that this entire relationship of covenant with him is what Yeshua renews in his flesh and in his time with the disciples when you see them at the Passover Seder. But a question that you could ask is, why do we use the word Brit? Because in Hebrew, the word Brit means to cut. So why do we use a term to describe a covenantal bond of relationship between us and God? Why do we use a terminology for that means to cut away? And the relationship is exactly, again, what circumcision teaches us, which is you need to cut away your own thinking, your own will, your own desires towards what you would want to sometimes do what is beneficial or best for that person in which you're in covenant with. A blood covenant back in the day between two individuals would be like me and Phil deciding that, we live in this vicinity, we live in this area near each other, we're taking care of our business, our household, doing what's required, and we make a covenant with one another that should anything happen to me or happen to him, we will take on the other's responsibilities, of family, of children, of friends, of employees, of whatever underneath the expansion of that relationship, whatever needs to be covered. And no matter where I happen to be in life, or no matter what I happen to be doing, or what phase of life I'm going through, if something happens to him, or vice versa, that blood covenant means I'm still obligated to do what was required to provide that service, and to provide that covering, and to provide that covenantal relationship. And that means I have to cut away from myself whatever is required to be able to provide that. And oftentimes the hardest part and the main part is going to be just simply what I wanted for myself instead. Now, the less of a selfish life we live, the more others focused of a life we live, the easier that's going to become. And again, this is why devotion and confession are a big component, and obedience and circumcision are another big paired component. Because you will find it much harder to be obedient to what God has said when you are regularly encumbered with things you should have cut away from your life. I personally am still struggling with this in an area of something in my life. I held on to the Magic the Gathering cards that I collected when I was a child for many, many years, and God turned them into a great financial resource for us later. But now, some years later, it's still turning into a problem where I just want to keep collecting them and investing my time into playing games with them at 50 years old when I should have been already cutting them away. and getting the benefit God intended out of them and setting them aside so that I can continue to move on in my studies or other times in my life. So again, this is still an ongoing learning process of what it means to prepare yourself. And the last two, the letter Rosh or the letter Resh is the Hebrew word Rosh, which means head, meaning head as in leader or, is that how I have it on the chart, I think? Yeah, it means head as in like the leader, or it can also mean first. So this is where we get the word Rosh Hashanah or Rosh Hashanah. Okay, it means the first of the months is what Rosh Hashanah means. So having this first of times, meaning head, the sages say that the letter is even drawn looking like the little curve that you see in the top right-hand corner is said to be the back of the head. And what do you find that takes place? What does it symbolize? Our mind, our logic, and reasoning. And what better of a spiritual illustration to define of what needs to take place with your logic and reasoning other than discipline? And you regularly have to choose to discipline yourself and engage yourself in discipline on a, again, sometimes minute by minute, daily basis. Dick happily reminds me as often as he needs to in a day, whenever my attitude gets out of control and I don't discipline myself and share what we call a 429. Right? He will happily remind me Ephesians 4:29 says, let no unwholesome speech come out of your mouth. And Dick has learned how to graciously turn that into a understanding of even attitude or demeanor or the way in which you even say something to someone. And it's true, it's real that we should be much more disciplined in our behavior and our thinking. Without discipline, I assure you, I know this, I've learned this in my marriage. I don't know how many of you have had marriage like me and Jen, but Dick and other people have been privy to it. And I have absolutely learned that without discipline, we will not have peace. And peace is a spiritual illustration of the last letter in this group, which is the letter Sheen.
Okay, please. On my sheet here, you had with poverty, head, leader, and poison. What's the poison for?
It's literally the word Reish, spelled R-E-I-S-C-H. It's a little bit different. Can also mean poison. And there's a deeper, it can also mean poverty. And there's just, without going into it all now, there's deeper connections that I can make to just connect those understandings. But it's actually some Hebrew stuff that I wrote when I was writing about these letters years ago. I found that out, and I have a whole couple paragraphs shared about some of the connections between them and how the words are used in the Scripture. But, so you can see in a sense, when you start with trust, you have devotion and confession. Wherever you devote your time, your life, and your efforts to, or what you're going to confess in life. And your obedience is absolutely going to be either hindered, or it's going to be employed, or I don't know what the word is I'm looking for here. It's going to grow. Your level of obedience can grow based on what you're doing with circumcision, based on how you're removing, cutting things away. Remember, in the text, circumcision is defined as the removal of blockage, because in the text we're told that male organs should be circumcised, ears, lips, and heart should all be circumcised. And the one thing that they all have in common is the flow of seed. When you speak to someone, you're hoping that their ears are unblocked so that they can hear it. You're hoping that their lips and your lips are unblocked when you're attempting to share a message with someone. You're hoping that the heart is unblocked when you're trying to get that word, that seed through, right? This is all the desire that we have. And so removing that blockage is what is going to enable or disable, depending on what you do, your obedience to what God has commanded. And discipline and peace are coupled together because it's required. Discipline is required for you to have peace. Because people tick you off all the time, at least they do me. And that's a discipline that I am lacking in my life, is to be patient in times when I should be. Is to be loving in times when I should be. And the more I strengthen that discipline in myself, the greater peace I'm going to have. It's that simple. But of course, sometimes when you're in a moment, it's not that simple. The very last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and now I'm going to tell you why those subletters are there. The very last letter in the Hebrew alphabet is the letter Tav, and the word Tav in Hebrew means either a sign, a mark, or it can also be the word for a cross.
How did you get tooth to peace?
Because Shen, literally, the word Shen is the word for tooth. The word Shin is the name of the letter. The word Shen is the word for tooth. And then the Sheen is the first letter of the word Shalom, which is the word for peace. And the Sheen is also the letter of fire. And you will oftentimes find that you do not have peace in your life without fire. Experiencing the fire of God, each man's work is tested by fire, will bring peace into your life. When this is why I say, because Sheen is the letter of fire, it looks like fire. It's the second letter of the word Aish, which is the word for fire. And this is why I shared back in our hellfire teaching that Paul says every man's work is tested by fire, and the man whose work endures receives a reward. But he doesn't tell you what the reward is. Because of this teaching, I tell you that the reward is peace. Because when a man's work has been tested by fire, and the only thing that remains is what you built correctly on the foundation of Christ, I can't imagine a better state to be in than a peacefulness knowing you actually built something that was right. The man whose work doesn't survive the fire, he goes on to tell us, suffers loss, but he is saved as though saved through fire. That's what he tells us. Go ahead, people.
Well, you're stopped. What did you say Zadi was?
The spiritual illustration?
No, your sheet tells us fish.
Yeah, I did say that it means righteousness, but it doesn't. It means those things that are on the sheet, but the letter Zadi is, so this box that we built here for tithing is literally called a tzedakah box, which means tzedakah is the word for charity or righteousness. A Zadi is a righteous man. So the letter's name Zadi could be said to be the word for righteousness, but in its root form, Azad is Azad is either a fish hook or a hunt, which are kind of the same root ideology, and then a Zadi can also mean a side. So these are other little definitions of it. I just don't have righteousness here, I don't think. So the letter Tav, the last letter of this, is the word for cross. And wouldn't you know that you have 3 groups of 7 letters, that's 21. These 3 groups seem to teach an illustration and a picture, and we could say they all circle around the final letter, which is the letter for cross. Everything centers on the cross and the work done at the cross. You understand the message of the gospel that was brought to you. You understand the process of discipleship that takes place in your life, the obligations and responsibilities you have. And then the third set of letters is the entire process that you will continue to go through, which is that process of sanctification provided by the work Yeshua did at the cross. It's a daily ongoing struggle, right? And we go through that. So here's why you have your sub-letters. Do you see where the letter Pei is on your sheet? Do you happen to notice what is inside the mouth? Look at the white. I've shared this with you for some of you, so somebody's going to catch it, I'm guessing. Look at the white negative space inside the Pei. What does it look like?
Fish hook.
The white negative, yeah, you can say that. The white negative space inside the mouth, inside the Pei, is said to be a letter Beit. That's why I put the Beit down there smaller so that you can see why the reference is made that way. You see the white negative space inside the Pei? It even has the base. You can even see the little curvature inside the Pei. That shows the floor, so to speak, of the Beit. You understand what I'm talking about? Right here. This white negative space that's inside the mouth, inside the Pei, is
Well, there's
essentially
a
this letter.
similarity.
Oh, okay.
What's your point here?
So if Beit is the Word of God made flesh, who came and dwelt among us, right? The letter or the word Beit means house, and so if it, as we said in the beginning of the alphabet, being the second letter, is the Word of God that came housed in flesh, then what else would you expect to find in the mouth in your confession? The Word of God, right? The only reason why I put those letters there is because I've never done this before over the years that I've known this about Beit, over the time and the years that I've known that they say, even the sages say that there seems to be a Beit inside the Pei. All the time that I've known that, I've never lined these letters up to just simply review how they fell. So again, take it or leave it. If you don't think there's a connection between any of this, feel free. But one thing I noticed is look all the way down at the bottom. The crowned man, the Zayin, finds its way at the cross. I just thought it was interesting the other day when I happened to notice this, that as you line those letters up, that's what you find. when you start with the Bay being inside the Pei, and you continue on with the alphabetical structure of the letters, you find Zayin reaches the cross. You understand? So the letters from the beginning of the alphabet go in their same numerical order. Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin. And Zayin finds itself connected to the cross. Each one of the other letters and their spiritual illustrations I refer to, and this is just another play on words for me. It's just another play with this illustration of the letters. If you just look at it this way, you can see some connections. If obedience is a spiritual illustration of Zadi that follows Pei, and Gimel is the letter that follows Beit in the alphabetical structure, then obedience to truth seems to line up pretty clearly. Because that's what you're intending to be right obedient to, is the truth that's come from God. With that in mind, we should remember that truth is very limited. When you have a math problem, right, you have a very limited answer as to 2 plus 2 is 4. But you have an unlimited wealth of wrong answers that you can apply to that. So oftentimes truth is very limited, and we have to study it out, find it, and apply it in our lives. If Dalet follows Gimel and Kof follows Zadi, how else do you find yourself in a position of giving charitably other than to learn how to cut away what you don't need? I'd never tried to line these up before and find some of these interconnections, but they spoke to me volumes this time about some of this. And look at what the framework, if we move on to the next one, if Resh follows Kof and Hey follows Dalet, look at the framework that God would reveal to us for grace. To me, I think this is a great revelatory point. We hear, and we've commented, I'm sure ourselves, on this concept of greasy grace that some people seem to have, or some Christian teaching takes the idea that you just go ahead and do whatever you want because the grace of God has, brought you to a place of salvation and you're free to do whatever you want. The best framework I can think of for understanding God's grace in your life is discipline. Understanding that, you're going to make mistakes periodically, and even while we were still yet sinners, Christ died for us. That's the grace of God. That's the grace of Christ working in our lives and working for the world, that even while we were still yet sinners, he laid down his life for us. How better to share that grace and to describe what it is than to discipline one's life and share your life and your understanding and your experience with grace in people in such a fashion. And peace is certainly the perfect framework for love, which was the last one that I made.
So
Ask any questions, and let's comment about this, and then we're going to move on to the last one and see how far we get.
So since you started with Beit, I find it interesting that Aleph and Ayin are the two silent ones.
That's where you had it.
Oh, never
That's
mind.
what this other sheet is. I'm sorry, what were you asking me, Dave, about Tom?
Is that what you're talking about now? That's the last one on my chart.
I did put it on there as the last one, and so Tub literally is the word for cross, and we said earlier that Zayin is literally the crowned man. That is that component of man and Vav coming together with the crowned man and forming the next letter Het. And so literally, to me, it was fascinating that the crowned man finds himself right next to the cross. It just, to me, it just makes that
That looks
simple
like
sense.
the final form of Saudi.
Yes, so it can actually. So one thing I didn't cover with you guys that we'll talk about some other time would be that when the letters are drawn, oftentimes they are said to be drawn, and I'm sharing with you now because we may see an example of it. The letters are said to be drawn using other letters. I shared that with you, that insight concerning the first letter, the letter Aleph. The letter Aleph is said to be drawn with a slanted Vav through the middle, and then a Yod on top and a Yod on the bottom. Right? That's how the letter is said to be drawn for those that draw them out. Go to this page. I do not have it numbered, so I cannot tell you the page, but the second page that I gave you, and the side that you want to be on at the top of the page, it talks about or, and then it says skin and light. Okay? So make sure that you're on that side of the page. We're going to go through this. Let me explain to you what this is. I told you at the beginning that Aleph and Ayin are the two silent letters of the 22 in the Hebrew alphabet. Aleph, the first letter of the alphabet, has a numerical value of 1, and we said, spiritually illustrates God, right? It spiritually illustrates serving, but it depicts an understanding of who God is. Again, I just told you, Aleph is constructed of a Vav in the middle, which has a numerical value of 6, and then a Yod at the top and a Yod on the bottom, which each have a numerical value of 10. And so 10 and 10 and 6 is 26, and God's four-letter holy name, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, has a numerical value of 26. Aleph is made in 3 parts. You can see it has a numerical value of 1. God is in 3 parts, but has a value of 1. God is 1. And so I could go on with some more references to show that this letter represents God. So it represents the spiritual, right? God is spirit, is what the text tells us in the New Testament. Ayin is literally the Hebrew word for eyes, and it looks like 2 eyes connected looking off to the left. And the left is the physical, and the right is the spiritual. I don't care whether you're in Old Testament or New Testament, anytime you see left and right mentioned, remember that the right is the spiritual and the left is the physical. So how does this bear out in the fact that Hebrew reads from right to left? Imagine a Torah scroll, if you will, for a moment. If you've never opened up a Torah scroll or God's Word and you've never read anything, then all of your knowledge is based on the left. It's based on what you see in the physical. Okay? All of your experiences, all of your knowledge is going to be based on that. But if you open the Torah scroll and you wind it up as you read through the language, eventually what you know and understand in your experiences begins to find itself moving to the right, so to speak. This, again, is part of our process of relationship with God, is becoming more spiritually minded beings as opposed to living only in this flesh. I know that we're referred to as mammals, but humans are actually more considered spiritually as amphibians because we are always physical beings existing in a spiritual world. As I speak, as I sit here and have this Bible study and this time of fellowship with you guys, it's not the flesh of your bodies that I'm speaking to. It's the soul that resides inside that is who you are. And that's what I'm hoping to connect with. That's what you're hoping to connect with when you talk to other people. So we were always trying to graduate ourselves and move over to the physical, or over from the physical to the spiritual. This entire story plays out between these 2 letters. Again, these 2 letters are the only 2 silent letters, and when you look at this chart, what you're going to find, this 12 words that I found here, is each of these words is spelled in Hebrew exactly the same, with the exception of interchanging the Aleph and the Ayin. And when you go from what is spiritual into what is physical, you'll see a connection in a teaching. And I've given you 12 examples on the sheet, many of which we're going to look at and go through. You will, as you continue to study and read and you look at the Hebrew, you'll find many of your own where this just regularly happens. Look at the first one that's on your page. You have the word or and you have the word or. The one spelled with an aleph, which is the one on the right, aleph is always going to be on the right side. So the one spelled with the aleph is the word that means light. And Adam and Eve, it's said traditionally that when they were created, they were clothed in the Shekinah glory of God. They were clothed in light. And when they sinned, the lights went out, and what became visible was their skin. And they realized they were naked. So when you replace the aleph and the word or, which means light, with an ayin, you get the word skin. Now, I'm not going to try and emphasize the idea that the physical is bad. So I don't want you to take from this that spiritual is good and physical is bad. Just understand that it's physical. You have some things in life that are spiritual, and you have other things that are physical. And so understanding the relationship between these is going to be part of the point. Look at the next one. The word on the left, ayin, is literally how you spell out the letter's name. I told you that the word ayin in Hebrew is the word for eye. And that's how you spell its name. Like if I ask you in English to spell the letter A, well, it's A, right? But in Hebrew, if I ask you to spell the letter ayin, it's spelled with a yod and with a final nun. And in Hebrew, that word means eye. But look what happens When you put an aleph in place of the ayin, it becomes the word ain, which is the word for nothing. What you think you see with your eyes is nothing in the spiritual world. Every single thing that we see here in this physical world is only a distraction and a lesson to prepare us for the world to come. No amount of suffering, no amount of experience that we have in this life is for any other purpose than to prepare us for the world to come. All of the things that we experience and we go through here, in compared to what we anticipate to experience there, are nothing. But yet we can devote ourselves to all of the physical materialism of the things we see in this world, and if we do that, it all means nothing. Because again, we are physical creatures and should be leaning towards the spiritual things of God. Look at the next one. This was a fantastic one for me. On the left, the Hebrew word anah is the word for humble. I didn't put it on your sheet, but you can write it in there if you want. The word anah means to be humble. It doesn't mean that you humbled yourself. The one with the ayin that says respond or to be dependent. It doesn't mean you humbled yourself. It means you were humble. So there's like 6 different Hebrew words for humble. It's a really fascinating word or concept in Hebrew, is the concept of being humble. Because there's like 6 different words, and they're all scenario-based. Either you humbled yourself, you were humbled by God, you were humbled by men, you were humbled by circumstances. There's a different word in Hebrew for each one of those, because each one of those is a different context and a concept. And in this particular case, this one means to not only be humbled by God, is how it's always used in Scripture, but it means to respond or be dependent on something. It means to respond. If you switch out the ayin for an aleph, and you have the same sounding word, anah, it means to cause or direct something towards its goal, or towards your goal. So when you want to direct something towards a goal that you have, you cause it to happen. That's what God does on a regular basis. And how does it manifest in the physical? What is the difference in the spiritual and the physical? In the spiritual, God causes things to happen. In the physical, we respond. To move something spiritually in this world begins with serving and finds its accomplishment through devotion. Those are the spiritual illustration of each of the letters again. The spiritual illustration of Aleph is to be prepared to serve. How devoted are you? Moving something throughout this world, a spiritual concept, a message of the gospel. To move something spiritually begins with serving and finds its accomplishment through devotion and dependence on Him. Dependence on who God is. And I asked a question on here that was kind of just a hypothetical question that came to me the other day. I wrote down, does our response to spirituality determine its causal? In other words, does your response to God doing something spiritual in your life determine whether or not something else is caused? In other words, if God does something in your life and you don't like it, you throw a fit, should you expect Him to bless you with something else? If He does bless you with something in your life and you show zero thanksgiving in your response, should you expect Him to bless you again? How does our response? I don't know that the answer to this is yes. I've kind of positioned it that way. But does our response here in the physical generate potentially God to continue to move in the spirit? It certainly is not the only catalyst, but I think it has something to do with it. Because at the end of the day, God is not going to bless any of us with something that's going to hurt us. Right? He's not going to bring something into our life that we aren't mature enough to handle, because we're either going to injure ourselves or we're going to injure other people. The next one is literally, if you look on the right, starting with the letter Aleph, look at that. That is how you spell its name. Aleph, or Aleph. It's spelled Aleph, Lamed, Pei. I wrote down that it means master, because that's what I have on your chart, and it does. It also means to receive from others. It can be a guide or a mentor, which is what a master properly should be, not like a slave master. That's when you say the word master, that's not what you're thinking. You're thinking a master is someone who truly guides and mentors those around them. But look what happens when you put an ayin in there and you pronounce it ulef. That's how the word will be pronounced. it means in the physical to faint away, to disappear from view. And how much more of a way can you describe what our discipled relationship with the Master should be? If you are literally connecting yourself to him in the spiritual, you should be fainting away and disappearing from view as he becomes more visible in your life. That's literally what the transition should be. Another one of the definitions of Aleph is receives from others. I put down a master receives loyalty while a servant receives an opportunity to be loyal. That's what the relationship is. And God, interestingly, some people might not incorporate this kind of thinking about him in their lives, but God, who says of himself, do not think that I came to be served, but I came to serve, looks for both opportunities. He looks for ways in your life that he can give you instruction that you as a servant can be loyal to, and he also looks for ways in your life that you can give him instruction on what you really need that he can be loyal to respond to and provide for you. And that's not a relationship of him being under you. That's a relationship of you acknowledging what it is you really should and shouldn't want in your life. And when you realize what it is to want the things of God in your life, and we finally reach that point of maturity, then he is able to be loyal to provide it. If I need, the best way I can think to deal with money and finances is if I need it in my life to accomplish the work he's given me to do, then it's going to be provided. If I don't need it, then I shouldn't be crying about it and be praying for it regularly if all I'm going to do with it is go out and spend it on my desires and on my will and on what I think I want, no matter what excuses I come up with. If it's time, if it's friendship, if it's relationships, if it's people, whatever it is, if I truly would only use it to gratify myself selfishly, God isn't going to injure me or other people around me by providing it if it's not needed. This next one is amar, which means to speak. Okay, and the definition that's in that etymological dictionary that I use, he has a beautiful definition in there, which is organized words to be heard and understood, is what he had in there. But it means the word amer. Remember I told you earlier that the difference between causeless hatred, sinat kinam, and causeless love, ahavat kinam, the difference is vayomer Elohim, and God said. Well, the word yomer that you hear in there is this word amar, which means to speak. In the physical, amer, spelled with an ayin, means to collect and reap advantages for oneself. In this one, it does kind of posit the idea that the physical can be bad. But what kind of advantages you're looking to reap for yourself and looking, to do, or the kind of advantages you're looking to take in, if it's for the benefit of those around you, is still just physical. But spiritually, another form of collecting, so to speak, is to organize words for an emphasis of being heard and understood. To speak.
Is that what you're doing now?
I'm attempting to. In the Spirit, what did I write down? In the Spirit, we procure to prepare for others. In the Spirit, we procure words. We look for thoughts and ideas to prepare for others. In the flesh, we take advantage of growth and reaping for ourselves. That's a possibility. So we have to be careful. Dave, go ahead.
Organized words to be heard and understood. If I hear them but I don't understand them, should I ask a question then? That's what I do sometimes.
Yeah. You should. Because it's also the obligation of the person organizing the words to not only be heard, but to be understood. And sometimes it requires a little bit more thoughtfulness, and certainly it requires a lot more patience sometimes on behalf of those speaking for us to get other people there.
And it's not because you don't know it, it's because they're already in it. You can't understand it. In my case, like it.
Whatever the reason. It still sometimes simply requires love and appreciation to get the words organized the way they should be. So the last one on this page I almost didn't include here. The last one on this page, I almost didn't include it until I read a story about how one of the words was used, and it amazed me about the story that it told. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to have to breeze through and give you a paraphrase of what happened in the story. But with the Aleph, the word apel means to darken in a state of preventing light from entering. And in the physical, what happens? If God chooses to do that, if he darkens something and refuses to let light enter in, then what can happen in the physical is it's restrained and discouraged. And that's what opel means. But there's a fascinating story that I think for some churches, I don't mean any in particular, but I just mean across the board in our Christianity, we should really take a second look at this story and really think about the obligations and responsibilities God is giving us about all of the sky's the limit, we got to build this, and this, that we sometimes put into our building of things. In Exodus 36, and I'm going to go ahead and bring it up real quick. I'm not going to share the other connection point that I had, but I'm just going to bring up Exodus 36 and share with you guys this story, give you the context of what's going on. So in Exodus 36, their tabernacle is underwritten is the subtitle that's given to this, and I'm just going to read the first few verses. It says, "Now Bezalel, Oliab, and every skillful person in whom the Lord put skill and understanding to know how to perform all the work and construction of the sanctuary shall perform in accordance with everything the Lord has commanded." So what this is talking about is that God appointed Bezalel, which interestingly means the onion of God. El is the word for God, and the word Bezel is the word for onion. And so this man, who is extremely skilled in craftsmanship and in building with wood, building with stone, building with gold, with all kinds of things, his name literally means onion of God. And that's because when you are building something for God or trying to study his word or break into it, sometimes tears and a little bit of bitterness may come in as you peel back the layers, attempting to discover who God is and to get the work done to build something for him. Okay? Dave, go ahead.
That reminds me of two things. The building of the Tower of Babel. Each god. Or whatever they read. And David's attempt to build the temple.
Okay, well let me get through this just so we can get to the insight. In verse 2, then Moses called Bezalel, Oliab, and every skillful person in whom the Lord had put skill to come and perform the work. I'm gonna read through this very quickly if you're trying to follow along. They received from Moses every contribution which the sons of Israel had brought to perform the work in the construction of the sanctuary, and they still continued bringing to him voluntary offerings every morning. So the people, besides these three, the sons and the daughters of Israel, are doing work to prepare gifts that they're bringing and presenting for the first initial building and raising of the tabernacle. Okay? And they keep bringing voluntary offerings every morning. And all the skillful people who were performing all the work of the sanctuary came each from the work which they were performing. And they said to Moses, now listen to this, the people are bringing much more than enough for the construction work which the Lord commanded us to perform. So Moses issued a command and circulated a proclamation throughout the camp saying, no man or woman is to perform work any longer for the contributions of the sanctuary. So the people were restrained from bringing any more. For the material they had was sufficient for more than enough of the work to perform it. They knew how to put a limitation on the light that people were bringing in. The people just wanted to keep giving their money, or they just wanted to keep doing the work, or they just wanted to keep providing one trinket after another for the building of it, and it wasn't needed. And what happened here is when the light, so to speak, that they were looking to put was restrained, there was a command given, which was stop trying to do the, and I'm paraphrasing, this isn't necessarily what happened in the text, I'm paraphrasing some of our Christian society today. Stop doing the easy thing of just throwing your money at the circumstance and get involved with the rest of us and do the work of building it. Because that's what we sometimes have a tendency to do. Now, certainly, the resources are needed.
That's right.
And certainly, they are obviously required for there to even be work prepared for people to do. And not all of us are certainly capable of doing what others are, right? Not all of us are builders or are masons or able to be carpenters and work with stone. But in this particular experience, here's what happened. They basically, the heads and the leaders of the church, put a stop to what the people were bringing in and said, we have more than what we need. So hold on to your resources and be prepared to do the work that we need to do to build now. And maybe if God is prepared and there's something for us to look at later, then we'll do that too, or we'll work on that later. But they didn't just keep receiving and receiving and receiving and trying to find something to do after the fact. Or just kept trying to find something to do later. And sometimes I think in our society we get a little bit ahead of we get the cart in front of the horse like that. And we find ourselves just simply wanting to come up with the next best thing we can build or we can do. And in some cases, the Lord may not be calling us to do that. It may be that the work He's called us to do is either not yet finished or is all that we need to do to meet the means or the necessary requirements of what we currently have. And we need to know when to limit ourselves. We need to know when to stop and say, well, no, this is all we need to do right now. I'm saying this so wholeheartedly because this is sometimes part of my problem. It's just always wanting to find the next best thing. And sometimes I just need to be content with where I'm at and with what God's given me to study, to read, to teach, to do. And not always try and find the next best thing. So the application of limitation is what's required in our growth. The application of limitation. Truth is always limited. We don't need, I don't mean to sound stereotypical of any particular place, but we don't necessarily need to build a church that can hold 50,000 people if all we need to do is create a few other cheaper resources, other places that can allow people to chime in, to get into a place where they're going to learn, to get into a place where they can put to use that what they're learning as they put their minds in the yoke with who Christ is. If we continue on and we go to the back, the first one that you have on the back is the word afar, which I love to share the teaching that God gave me some years about this. I'd never seen this connection. The word afar is the word for dust, and that's the one with the ayin. And literally, it's the word you find in the beginning of the scripture where God makes man from the afar of the earth, the dust of the earth. And then after they sin and they have the issue with the serpent, you know what God tells them? You will crawl on your belly and dust will be your food. God picked up the dust of the earth, which is part of what the serpent feeds on, and He then intentionally makes man in His hand, so to speak, and then He breathes into him the breath of life. If we aren't focusing on that spiritual side of who we are in our creation, if we aren't focusing our time and attention on the breath of life God has given us, then all we are is dust, and that's food for the serpent. If you replace the ayin with an aleph and you have the word aper, or iper, that's another kind of covering. But look what kind it is. It's a bandage. The word afar with an ayin means to cover something over with dust, which has zero health benefits in any way, shape, or form. The word a pair with an aleph not only means bandage, covering, but I discovered yesterday as I continued to research this more that it's also the word for ashes, which sounds very much like dust, right? But you know what I discovered? Ashes, which come from a fire, are a huge phosphate, pH balanced nutrient source for seeds that need to grow. Dust does not provide that, but ashes do. And the ash tree, it was funny, at first I kept reading all these medical benefits of ash, and I'm like, are you kidding me? How can all these medical benefits be coming from ash? And then I realized that I was reading about the ash tree. It just didn't dawn on me that that's what it was the ash tree. So the ash tree has like 16 different medical benefits that are wonderful, that when you grind it up and you do all these different things, it provides all kinds of stuff for the body. But ashes themselves, like from a fire, provide nutrients for the ground that causes the pH levels to rise and the alkalinity, and it enables seeds to grow and sprout. Where again, you're covering the dust of the earth, which does none of that, with ash to cause growth. So again, this...
It won't cause good potatoes to grow.
Maybe not. But this is the relationship, again, between Aleph and Ayin. This is what it looks like in the spiritual and what the manifested relationship can be like in the physical. Right? The next one, Orag and Arag, were another one that I almost left out because I wasn't quite sure how to define the connection. But I really spent some time just thinking about it, meditating on it, decided to include it. The word arag with the ayin, meaning panting thirst, is used in the psalm where David describes that his soul pants for the relationship with the Lord just the same way the deer pants in the brook and has a thirst and desires to fill her thirst. And you know, the relationship that we are panting for and the relationship that we desire is to have not just a relationship with God, but one that we are completely entwined and woven in with him and have him woven in our lives. That's the relationship. When we don't have that spiritual connection and relationship with him, where it is a woven work, a relationship with him, an input, an investment of ourselves, what that looks like here in the physical is a thirst. And you know you'll die from thirst before you'll die of starvation. That's how imperative it is. And it just really makes me wonder sometimes if some of the issues of headaches and some of the issues of other things that I have in life that I oftentimes feel are manifesting because of a physical thirst and not drinking enough water throughout the day. I just really wonder if that has been a sign, in the last few days I've been thinking about this, if that's a sign in my life where there's other areas of my life I could be weaving God more closely into and I'm not. You know, how can I make that change? In this next one, all I have to do is tell you the definitions of the words and you should see how beautiful this connection is. The word Ishay with the Aleph means being or existing. The word aseh with the ayin means to make and to create. What God does in just being and existing is what we attempt to do here, which is make a life for ourselves, make a living. But look at what happens in the spiritual. It can also, so the word for fire, and I'll just show you this again. The word for fire is the word aish, which all you have to do is take off the hay, and you have the word for fire. It's just aleph and sheen. And that's why another definition of an ishay is a fire-shaped material. Something that's been passed through the fire, and you can see the residual effects of the fire on it when it comes out. That's what it's describing. And that literally is what we should be in this physical life looking to make of ourselves. That's what the epitome of our whole teaching and the hellfire teaching was months ago. Is be prepared to understand every man's work will be tested with fire. And when we submit ourselves to that fire, when we look to conform our lives in such a way that the works we build will be founded on him, we should be looking to submit our work to the testing of the fire as often as possible. Now, of course, we don't want to have trial and tribulation in our lives, and we don't want to test God to bring in more than what is required or what is needed. But enabling ourselves to experience the fire sooner than later is a good thing. Let me put on here. Yeah, to be shaped through trial spiritually and made physically after his likeness. So another thing that's interesting, and I need to show you this.
Is there more meanings to these that help you establish which one is physical and which one is spiritual?
I don't understand what you just asked.
Well, if I interchange this, I said physical is on the left and spiritual is on the right, and that's so in the Hebrew writings. But
Yeah, the right is the physical and the left is the spiritual, the right is the spiritual and the left is the
you
physical.
put these similar words together in that manner. left and right. At least I wrote down that you did.
Yes, and I did do that intentionally, yes. It wasn't something I mentioned, but yeah, you caught that, and yeah, that's something I did intentionally as I put them on here. Because one, Aleph comes before Ayin as well in the alphabetical structure. And again, Hebrew reads from right to left. Let me show you this real quick as we go through this, and this is just a little rabbi trail here that we'll take just to talk about something that's interesting. I don't know if you can see this down there. This right here is the word for man in Hebrew. It's the word ish. And then this right here is the word that you had on your sheet just now that we were looking at. This is the word for woman, which is the word isha. Now what's fascinating about man, the word for ish, and woman, isha, is that you have a yud right here in the middle, which is the first letter of God's name. And then you have a hey over here, which is the second letter of God's name. And oftentimes God's name is abbreviated this way throughout the Hebrew text, and it's pronounced Yah. And so you have Yud Hey as the first letters of his name. So man has a portion of God's character, so to speak, in him, and woman has a portion of God's character in it. And guess what? When you bring man and woman together, if you take out God, all you're left with is an Aleph and a Shin, which is the word for fire. So when man and woman come together, if you remove God from their midst, all you're left with is fire. So it's just a small little thing that I was taught years ago, but it's definitely something to understand in the creation of how God has created us. So you have to, you got to understand what it means to really incorporate God into your relationship. If we look at the next one on the sheet is Osher and Asher. The word Asher with the Aleph is the word for happy. And I forgot to tell you, for those of you that are Hebrew students, there was something I did for you. If you want to do it, you can. If you have room on your page, I spelled out in English what the vowels should sound like on each one of these words. If, as homework, you want to go back and practice your vowels, you can learn how to write the vowels on these words to make it make those sounds. Okay? So I did that for you guys, so that way, one, I can't put the vowels on here without doing a whole bunch of extra work. And for some reason, this little chart here that I made took me like 2.5 hours to get this made the other night when I was working on it. So Asher means to be happy, but it also means to progress, to move forward. Okay? It means to progress, to move forward. It's also the word for happiness, but it also can mean that, who, and which. The word asher means those three things grammatically. It's one of the biggest widely used words in the scripture because it means that, who, or which, and it creates that concept. Osher is the word for tithe. It can also mean to enrich, and it also, which is what tithing is, means to remove 10% of something. Okay? To be happy spiritually, you need to reduce yourself physically. I mean, it doesn't get much simpler than that. That's the connection between the two. To be happy spiritually, you need to reduce yourself physically. The less you have to concern yourself with, the happier you're going to be. Especially when you've had things in life and you've experienced unhappiness because of one reason or another. To enrich others physically is to help fill them spiritually, which makes them happy. It goes both ways in the connective tissue between these two. I mean, all of us, most of us, have been in a position where we've seen somebody that was financially in distress. And if they're financially in distress and you tell them, well, all you need to do is love Jesus better in your life, you've done a great disservice to them, especially if you're in a position to help them financially. We all know that. I know you guys are more than mature enough to know that. So every time you've seen somebody who was in some form of financial distress and you came alongside them and you helped them, it opened up the door for you to connect with them spiritually.
Somebody said something like that. It said when they're hungry, it's very hard to tell them the answer to Jesus.
Yeah, don't just tell them to be happy and be fed.
Bring them food. And Jesus did that himself. Brought them food.
So we do have an obligation to be discerning and to be non-abusive if we do something for somebody in the physical, to then start trying to inundating them and make them feel like they have no choice but to sit and listen to a 5-hour sermon from us, right? So we have to be non-abusive and we have to be loving and appreciative of what they've done, because I've seen that backfire too. I was once down in Florida with my dad, my real dad, and Jen, and there was a homeless guy that was there, and we happened to give him something to eat, and he counted up from the table he was at, came over to sit down with us, and about 10 minutes later in the conversation, my dad started really sharing some basic, salvation understanding of the gospel with him, and the guy became extremely irate and extremely angry and wanted to know why it was that we felt so insistent that we, had to inundate him with all of this spiritual information or whatever when we could have just sat there and enjoyed his company. And it was simply because he was a non-believer. There was obviously my dad really trying to push the issue, not much, but a little bit more than he should have. And then there was clearly a problem with the individual being as angry, as irate as he was. So it was a mix. But either way, we have to learn to be discerning. I don't necessarily fault my dad for what he did. He was just simply sharing some basic information, trying to reach the guy, and the guy just, didn't want to hear it. But either way, we still have to be loving and appropriate. The next ones are a fantastic insight about some things. The word olam we studied in our teaching related to the hellfire teaching. We looked at this word and we understood that it was translated as eternal, but yet the word olam can also mean for only as long as the hills last. And the hills don't last forever. So if we just simply translate the word olam as meaning eternity or eternal, like eternal hellfire, that was the whole point of that teaching, then we have a problem. Because that's not what olam means. Olam means to be forever hidden. Means to be hidden. Oftentimes it's translated as forever and can mean that, but it means to be hidden. The time of olam is hidden from us. We don't know when God has established the end of things. So it could be forever. It could also come to an end. In Hebrew, spelled with an aleph, the word olam means to bind, right? So what God has bound spiritually is forever hidden from us in the physical. It means to bind. It also means to be silent, as in the way we understand the dumb, right? Those that are able, or those that are unable to see, unable to hear, unable to speak. We have, that's how we use the term. Oftentimes we use the term dumb as a derogatory, insultive statement for people. But the dumb are those that can neither speak nor hear. And so what it really means is unable to speak and without voice. Now here is what I found years ago that I just thought was fantastic, is the word ilum, which means the dumb. God gives in his Torah commandments a very strict and instructive commandment to us not to set up a stumbling block in front of the ilum. And the ilum are the dumb. We are to take care of them and not to set up a stumbling block. And he says very specifically what the penalties are and what he will do to those who set stumbling blocks up in front of them. God's very specific and very clear in his feeling about this. And one of the reasons that I find fascinating, and again, look at this here. Now I'm going to try and describe this to you with this final mem, okay? The word olam that you're looking at on your sheet is aleph, lamed, mem. And it's a final mem, so it looks a little bit different in the block print. And I don't have another example on your page, but I'll try and draw it.
That one's almost dead.
I'll try and draw it on the back of another one of these papers so that you can see it differently. Okay, so look here. The aleph, I told you, is drawn, and all of the Hebrew letters are said to be drawn using a combination of the other letters. This is what you read in all kinds of Hebrew books or from the sages or whatever else. The aleph is drawn with a vav slanted, which has a numerical value of 6, and a yod up here and a yod below. Yod means hand. So you have God's hand up here above, you have our hand down here below. Yod has a numerical value of 10. This yod has a numerical value of 10. This is a vav, that's 26. That's God's 4-letter holy name, has a value of 26. The lamed is said to be drawn with a kaf down here. The mem is said to be drawn with a kaf down here. And then there's a vav on top of the lamed, and here is a vav to the side. Okay? Kaf has a numerical value of 20, and vav has a numerical value of 6. The word for ilum, which God says are close to his heart, each one of the 3 letters that spell the word ilum, each in their construction have a value of equal value to God's name. This is why they're so close to his heart. because at the heart of their construction, they're constructed after his likeness. Sometimes God is silent in our lives when we wish he wasn't. Sometimes God does not communicate to us in the way that we would like him to. Our job is to make sure that we aren't putting any stumbling blocks either in front of the Elam or in front of our relationship with him. Don't let his silence from your plea or your perceived silence as his response to your plea deter you from moving forward. If he doesn't want you moving forward, or if it's an extremely unsafe situation, I think he'll prevent that when your heart is right and you're desiring to do for him what you believe is right, even if it's making a mistake. Even if you have to change your thinking and your understanding later and you have to change your level of interaction, he will still protect us if we're going into a bad situation. Now, if you know you're going into a sinful situation and you can care less what God thinks and that's what you desire, guess what? He's going to care less what happens to you to some degree. He's going to let you march your way right into it. But if you truly are desiring to serve him and to do what's right, and that's your approach, then he will change things as is necessary to get you where you need to be in your growth and maturity. So the last one I was going to save for Dave and Tanya to elaborate on a little bit for us, to talk about something when it comes to science, because this is the best way I could think to include this one and communicate it. In Hebrew, the word EA means to isolate, and spelled with an IA means to isolate, but for two different purposes. And I kept pondering to try and figure out how to describe what is the connection between the spiritual and the physical in this. But both words mean to isolate, and they both, while meaning the same thing, have different purposes behind them. Tanya, I'll let you go first if you want to answer this. Dave, if you want to add something, feel free. But when it, not medically, when we isolate because of COVID, we understand what that means. But when you want to isolate or use that term isolate something in science and study, what is your goal?
Generally to study it and break it down to a fundamental level. To find out just what that one thing is. I don't know where you're going with this.
To
So.
separate it from all the other things
Yeah.
that might be irrelevant.
Just so you know what the one thing.
Contribute to a negative understanding.
And so when we isolate ourselves here in this world, especially for negative reasons, because we're sick of people or we're sick of the world, isn't that in a sense the opposite reason why you isolate? The reason you guys are defining and clearly understanding science is that you're trying to understand the origin, you're trying to understand the purpose, and you're trying to isolate and separate it from other elements so that you can see the benefit of it and derive something from it that's beneficial. Isolation oftentimes here in the physical is because we're sick of stuff and we want to get away from it. And it's not necessarily a positive focus. So if there is any other definition I could give to you of the difference between these two words, it's that. That's what I see as some of the connection between this, is that there's two different purposes. If your spiritual focus is to understand the origin of it, so it's a benefit for the world or a benefit for those around, then that's EA. And the IA is a form of isolation with an attempt to ruin or destroy. In other words, I'm sick and tired of being around these people. I want to destroy the impact they're having on me. I'm sick and tired of the world having an influence over me. I'm just going to separate myself and throw walls up and not let anybody like me now, because I'm tired of interacting with the world. That form of isolation is not beneficial, and it's not helpful. And I've known many a Christian or many of a God-minded person who claim to be a believer who are so sick and tired of things the way they are, they throw their hands up in the air, throw walls up around them, and they want to shut themselves out from having any interaction with the world. And that's not good isolation. That destroys their faith. It ruins their opportunity to have any form of interaction with people. And it certainly doesn't help anyone, including themselves, understand the origin from where they came and where their faith comes from.
That is true.
I put down isolation of flesh is intended to kill virus and rid of its spread. even here in the physical, when we just went through the whole experience of COVID, that was always the purpose of isolation, was to simply kill that or destroy that which was causing pain or suffering, right? Those that contract the virus or spread it. Anybody have any questions, comments, or anything else? I don't know exactly.
Yeah, how did you manage, what technique did you use? These are very similar words, with only one minor difference, and they demonstrate the similarity in silent letters at the same time. Not that you use that all throughout. But how did you separate one to be physical as opposed to one being spiritual?
Because ayin, okay, so there's only 2 letters in the Hebrew alphabet that are silent. The Aleph, we clearly can see so many connections to being representative of God.
Okay, that's how you did it. It's the
Yes.
letter themselves.
Yeah, so the letter Aleph is indicative,
Is
Yeah.
which one is spiritual, and one is actual.
and ayin is literally the word for eye, which is physical.
Yeah. Okay.
And the text tells us that God is spirit. So, anybody else? All right, thanks for putting up with me so long and for going through the last 3 weeks of this. I do have about 20 to 23 pages or something of the next Bible study that I started. I think it was probably a year ago that I started it, right? Remember when we were doing the 10 Commandments study? I started working on this while we were doing that, and it starts and picks up immediately following the 10 Commandments in Exodus. It's like chapter 22 or 23. We'll be studying some stuff there and starting at that point. And it was that teaching was supposed to be connected to that study, and we just got completely away from it and never got into it. So I'm going to go back in and start working on more notes for that, and I'm going to try and get to the best of my ability, I'm going to get myself back into emailing you ahead of time. So when you do get your first email of this information, you're going to have about 20 to 25 pages of information that you can print at your own leisure, and then as we continue moving forward through it, you'll have to print only the new pages that you need. I'll keep sending you the same document as I add to it, and that'll be that.
So that was, halfway through. Okay.